Imagine waking up tomorrow and every single person on Earth had a job assigned to them at birth. Not chosen, not applied for, biologically determined. Some people are born the size of children but never grow, spending their entire lives tending gardens in underground chambers. Others are born as giants with jaws powerful enough to snap through bone, existing solely as living weapons. And you might be born somewhere in the middle, your entire existence dedicated to carrying food from one place to another, never sleeping, never resting, marching the same path hundreds of times a day until you die. This isn't a dystopia. This is reality for one of the most successful civilizations on the face of this planet. A civilization that has existed for 60 million years. A civilization that has mastered agriculture, architecture, air conditioning, chemical communication, and military strategy without a single individual ever attending a class, reading a book, or making a conscious plan. And somehow, with no central government, no leader giving orders, no blueprint or constitution, millions of individuals operate in perfect harmony to build something that dwarfs almost anything else in the natural world. I'm talking about leafcutter ants, and by the end of this video, I promise you, you will never look at an ant the same way again. Because the story of leafcutter ants isn't really a story about insects. It's a story about intelligence itself, what it is, how it emerges, and whether the version we humans are so proud of is really as unique as we think. Let's start where most people start, on the forest floor of Central or South America, standing over one of the most extraordinary sights in the natural world. Picture a highway. Not a metaphorical highway, a literal, physically cleared, maintained, and trafficked road stretching through the forest floor, sometimes up to 10 lanes wide. And along this highway, millions of ants are marching. Each one carries a fragment of leaf above its head, a green sail that can be 5 to 10 times the ant's own body weight. From a distance, it looks like the ground itself is moving, like the forest floor has come alive and decided to relocate. Most people who see this for the first time think they understand what they're looking at. Ants carrying leaves. Simple. Industrious, sure, impressive even, but fundamentally simple. But the moment you lean in and look closer, the simplicity dissolves entirely and is replaced by something that will stick in your brain for years. Because on top of many of those leaves, writhing like passengers on a ship, are smaller ants, tiny ones. And your first instinct might be that they got confused, swept up in the chaos, accidentally carried along by the traffic. That instinct is completely wrong. Those little ants are soldiers on a mission. They are guards, sentinels. And the enemy they are guarding against is one of the most sinister creatures in the insect world. Parasitic phorid flies. These flies hover over the marching columns looking for an opportunity. Their strategy is brutal and elegant. They dive toward the leaf-carrying ants and attempt to inject their eggs directly into the ant's body. If they succeed, the larvae hatch inside the ant and eat it alive from the inside out. It's a form of biological warfare that has been going on for millions of years. And the leafcutter ants have evolved a living countermeasure. The smaller ants, called minims, ride the leaves specifically because their size lets them intercept and fight off these flies, while the larger forager ants keep their mandibles locked on their cargo and keep moving. A perfect defensive system, running continuously, 24 hours a day. This is the moment where the story of leafcutter ants stops being a story about insects carrying things and becomes a story about a civilization with specialized military units, supply chains, and strategic defense systems. And we've barely scratched the surface. To understand leafcutter ant society, you have to understand something that challenges almost everything we intuitively believe about individuality and purpose. Within a single colony, there are ants so different from one another in size and shape that early naturalists initially thought they were different species entirely. At the smallest end, you have the minims, delicate, tiny ants whose bodies are optimized for navigating the intricate, fragile structures of the fungus garden. They are gardeners and nurses. Their size is not a disadvantage, it is a precise evolutionary tool. A larger ant moving through the fungus garden would be like an elephant moving through a greenhouse. The minim can tend, prune, and manage with surgical precision. Then there are the media workers, the ones you most commonly see on that highway carrying leaves. They are mid-sized, and their entire body plan is essentially a cutting and carrying machine. Their mandibles are significantly more robust than those of the minims, built specifically for slicing through leaf tissue efficiently. Their legs are calibrated for sustained travel. Everything about them says long-distance laborer. Above them are the major ants, sometimes called soldiers, and they are a completely different order of magnitude. Their heads can be 5 millimeters wide. They can weigh 50 times what a minim weighs, and their mandibles, powered by muscle mass that is disproportionately large even for their already large bodies, are capable of piercing human skin. Scientists who studied the bite force of these soldiers found something remarkable. They expected that an ant 30 times heavier than a smaller worker would have a bite force 30 times greater. Instead, it was 80 times greater. The evolutionary investment in muscle volume inside those massive heads is extraordinary, suggesting that the soldier caste is not just a bigger ant doing the same job. It is an entirely different biological instrument, purpose-built for destruction. And then, in some species, you even have larger supermajors, the absolute upper limit of ant body size in these colonies, enormous compared to the rest, acting as the colony's heaviest frontline defense. So how does one mother produce all of this? How do you get offspring ranging from the tiny minim to the enormous supermajor? The answer involves genetics, nutrition, and a reproductive strategy that is genuinely bizarre. Every leafcutter ant colony begins with a single moment of extraordinary chaos, the nuptial flight. Once a year, in synchronized response to environmental triggers like temperature, humidity, and the length of daylight, every leafcutter ant colony in a region simultaneously releases its reproductive individuals. These are winged males and winged young queens, and they all take flight on the same night. The scale of this is almost impossible to picture. Millions of flying ants from thousands of colonies filling the air at once. A synchronized biological event so massive it can be detected on weather radar. High in the atmosphere, so high, in fact, that scientists have never directly observed it happening, the mating takes place. And when I say mating, I mean something quite specific and unusual. Each queen does not mate with one male. She mates with between 3 and 8 different males during a single flight. This is called obligate multiple mating, and it is not accidental or incidental. It is a core feature of the reproductive strategy. The reasons for this are several, and they compound on each other beautifully. First, genetic diversity. A colony of millions of ants living in tight quarters in an underground nest is an ideal environment for disease to spread catastrophically. Having offspring from multiple fathers increases the genetic variation within the workforce, which means greater resistance to pathogens. It's a biological hedge against epidemic. Second, there's the practical matter of longevity. The queen will live for 10 to 20 years, among the longest lifespans of any insect on Earth, and she will never mate again after this single flight. She stores all the sperm she collects in a specialized internal organ called the spermatheca, essentially a living sperm bank, drawing from it over decades to fertilize her eggs. Getting a large, diverse supply of genetic material in one go is the only way this system works. And third, and this is the part that connects back to that astonishing range of castes, having multiple fathers dramatically expands the range of possible phenotypes in her offspring. When the genetic contributions of several different males combine with her own genetics in different combinations, the developmental possibilities multiply. This is at least part of the explanation for how one queen produces offspring as different as the minim and the supermajor. The specific mechanisms by which the queen controls which genetic combinations produce which caste sizes remains an active area of research, and the full answer is not yet known, but the foundation is there in the genetics. After mating, the queen lands, sheds her wings, she will never use them again, and begins to dig. She excavates a small chamber in the soil, and before she left her mother colony, she tucked a small piece of fungus inside her mouth. This is her most precious cargo. Everything that is about to happen depends on that tiny piece of fungus surviving the journey. Inside her new chamber, alone for the first time, the queen spits out her fungal payload and begins to tend it. She lays eggs. She feeds the developing fungus with the nutrients from her own body, metabolizing the flight muscles she will never use again. Within 3 days, the fungal mycelium begins to grow. Within a few weeks, her first eggs hatch. And here is where the strategic genius of the colony's development becomes apparent. The queen's first offspring are not soldiers, they are not large foragers, they are minims, the smallest possible workers. This makes perfect sense when you think about where the colony is at this stage. The fungal garden is tiny and fragile, the space is small. What the founding colony needs more than anything is careful, precise tending of that garden, and the minim is perfectly designed for exactly that. As the colony grows slightly, the queen begins producing slightly larger ants, workers just big enough to leave the nest and forage in the immediate vicinity, bringing back small leaf fragments to feed the fungal culture. These early foragers also tend the brood, multitasking in the way that smaller colonies require. But a growing colony with food is an attractive target. Army ants raid leafcutter nests and prey on the young. Birds, bats, and other predators are drawn to the activity. Without protection, everything the queen has built can be destroyed in minutes. So, at a precise point in the colony's development, determined by cues the queen reads from her environment and her workforce, she begins producing soldiers. The major ants hatch, take up positions at the nest entrance and along the foraging trails, and the colony's security changes fundamentally. With security established, the colony can afford to grow aggressively. And as the fungal garden expands, the demand for leaf materials skyrockets. The minims can no longer keep up with foraging. So, the queen shifts her egg production again, and a new wave of media workers hatches, those mid-sized, mandible-heavy, marathon-running leaf cutters who will spend the rest of their lives on that highway, cutting and carrying, in an endless loop that feeds the fungus, that feeds the colony. The sequence is not random, it is a developmental program, a biological algorithm inside the queen's reproductive system, producing the right workers at the right time in the right numbers to match the colony's current needs. How the queen reads those needs and adjusts her egg-laying accordingly is one of the most fascinating unsolved problems in myrmecology, the scientific study of ants.
Let's pause on something that sounds mundane, but is actually extraordinary. The act of cutting a leaf. When a media worker arrives at a suitable leaf, she grips it with her hind legs, anchoring herself to the edge, and then pivots around her own body axis in a slow arc, pushing her mandible through the leaf tissue as she turns. This is why leafcutter cuttings are almost always semicircular. The geometry is a direct product of the cutting mechanics. One side of the mandible drives forward while the other drags through the material, creating a clean arc. Those mandibles are not simply hard pieces of chitin, they are bioengineered cutting tools of remarkable sophistication. The mandible is constructed from chitin nanofibers and proteins, giving it structural strength, and then coated with a biomaterial that incorporates zinc, the same heavy metal used in high-grade cutting tools, mixed with proteins in a way that makes the edge as hard and durable as stainless steel. An individual meteor worker can cut thousands of leaf fragments in its lifetime without the mandibles dulling significantly. But there is one more component to the cutting process that I find genuinely astonishing, and it involves sound. If you were to stand near a leafcutter foraging site and listen carefully, you would hear two things: a clicking sound as the mandibles bite through leaf tissue, and underneath it, a constant background hum, a high-frequency vibration that seems to emanate from the ants themselves. This vibration is called stridulation, and it is produced by a specialized organ on the ant's body called the stridulatory organ, essentially a microscopic file and scraper that, when rubbed together, generate a sound and vibration that travels through the ant's body and into the leaf. What this vibration does to the leaf is remarkable. It stiffens the soft plant tissue momentarily, giving the mandible a firmer surface to cut against. It's the equivalent of a surgeon using a vibrating scalpel. The oscillation reduces the resistance of the material being cut. The ant is using sound as a cutting tool. But the story of stridulation in leafcutter ants goes much deeper than mechanics. These vibrations also function as communication signals. Experiments have shown that ants stridulate significantly more when cutting tender, high-quality leaves than when cutting tough or low-quality ones. When scientists artificially sweetened leaves with sugar, nearly every worker cutting those leaves stridulated at a higher rate. The vibrations are, in effect, a quality signal, a way for individual foragers to broadcast to nearby colony members that the current harvest site is particularly good and worth visiting. It is a form of distributed, real-time agricultural intelligence running through vibrations in plant tissue and the bodies of the ants themselves. What makes this especially interesting is that scientists believe the cutting facilitation came second. The communication likely evolved first. Stridulation as a general signaling mechanism used in many contexts, including calling for help when buried or coordinating nest construction, and the coinciding stiffening of leaf tissue was a bonus that natural selection then reinforced. The same signal that says, "Come here, this leaf is delicious," also happens to make cutting the leaf easier. Evolution found a 2-for-1 deal. The stridulation signals are impressive, but they represent only a small corner of the communication infrastructure that leafcutter ant society runs on. The primary network is chemical, a system of pheromone signals so sophisticated, so precisely calibrated, and so astonishingly efficient that it makes our most advanced telecommunications look blunt by comparison. Start with the trails themselves. Those forest floor highways don't just happen, they are constructed. Leafcutter workers actively clear them, removing vegetation, cutting through obstacles, leveling the soil surface, and an established colony will maintain nearly 3 kilometers of cleared trail per year. This is remarkable on its own. But what's even more remarkable is how the trails are created and maintained in the first place. The ants don't follow the trails by sight, they follow them by smell. As workers travel the route, they deposit chemical signals, pheromones secreted from their poison glands that mark the path for others. This chemical marking serves 2 distinct purposes, and the ants have evolved 2 different types of chemical signals to serve them, each with precisely the right physical properties for its function. The recruitment signal, the one meant to call distant ants to join the trail, is highly volatile. It evaporates quickly and disperses widely, which is exactly what you want if your goal is to attract ants from far away. It's a broadcast signal designed for range. The orientation signal, the one that defines the permanent path itself, is far less volatile. It persists on the ground surface for much longer, creating a stable chemical road that workers can follow repeatedly. It's a storage signal designed for duration. The sensitivity of the ants to these pheromones is almost incomprehensible. Scientists measured how little of the volatile trail pheromone is needed to get ants to follow an artificially laid trail, and the answer was 0.4 picograms per meter. A picogram is 1/trillionth of a gram. At that concentration, 1 milligram of pheromone, a quantity so small you could barely see it on your fingertip, would be sufficient to lay a trail long enough to circle the entire planet 60 times, and the ants would still follow it. This extraordinary sensitivity is made possible by the olfactory hardware inside the ant's brain. The process begins at the antennae, which are densely packed with olfactory receptor neurons. Those neurons send signals to the antennal lobes in the brain, which contain structures called glomeruli, spherical processing units that sort, filter, and interpret odor information. The number of glomeruli in an ant's brain is a direct measure of how finely tuned its sense of smell is. A fruit fly, for comparison, has 43 glomeruli per antennal lobe. A leafcutter ant has up to 459. The chemical world that a leafcutter ant perceives is to ours as a high-resolution photograph is to a rough sketch. And the chemical communication doesn't stop at trail pheromones. The ants use chemical signals to distinguish nestmates from strangers, to signal alarm, to identify which caste is needed where, to coordinate defense, to mark the queen, and to maintain the extraordinary social coherence of a colony of millions. The entire society is, in a very real sense, a chemical conversation happening continuously at a scale and a resolution we can barely imagine.
Now we get to the thing that sits at the heart of everything. The reason for the trails, the reason for the castes, the reason for the mandibles and the pheromones and the soldiers and the entire extraordinary machinery of the colony. The fungus farm. Leafcutter ants do not eat the leaves they carry. They never have. The leaves are raw material, substrate for a living crop that the ants cultivate, tend, harvest, and have been dependent on for 60 million years. The fungus is called Leucoagaricus gongolophorus, and it produces enzymes that break down the cellulose and other complex carbohydrates in the leaf material into forms the ants can actually digest. Glucose, amino acids, and other nutrients, packaged into small swollen structures on the fungal hyphae called gongolidia, which function essentially as purpose-made food pellets for the colony. This is genuine agriculture, not metaphorical agriculture, not incidental agriculture. Deliberate, methodical, multi-generational cultivation of a domestic crop that exists nowhere else on Earth except within leafcutter ant colonies. The fungus has been domesticated so completely over so many millions of years that it has lost the ability to survive outside of ant care. It depends on the ants to bring it nutrients, to maintain the temperature and humidity of its environment, to protect it from competitor fungi and bacteria, and to spread it when new colonies are founded. The ants, in turn, have lost the ability to synthesize certain amino acids that the fungus provides for them. They have outsourced parts of their own biochemistry to the crop. They are as dependent on the fungus as the fungus is on them. This mutual dependence is the hallmark of the deepest kind of symbiosis, and it developed over an extraordinary span of evolutionary time. The ancestor of modern leafcutter ants, living perhaps 50 million years ago in the warm, wet litter of ancient tropical forests, likely began by simply eating wild fungi that happened to grow near or within the nest, what scientists call lower agriculture, a loose, opportunistic relationship. Then, around 35 million years ago, a global climate shift cooled and dried the planet. The wild fungi could no longer thrive in the open environment, but inside an ant nest, temperature-controlled, humidity-regulated, protected, they could survive. And the ants that maintained and fed those fungi did better than ants that didn't. Selection pressure drove both partners toward deeper and deeper mutual dependence, and what emerged over millions of generations was higher agriculture.
the fully domesticated, fully co-evolved relationship that exists today. This is one of those evolutionary stories that rewards thinking about at length, because what it illustrates is that complex, interdependent systems don't require foresight or planning. They require only differential survival. The ants didn't decide to become farmers. They were pushed there, step, by the same relentless logic that shapes every evolutionary story. The variants that do slightly better leave more offspring. Repeat for millions of years. Wake up to find you're a farmer. If the fungus farm is the purpose of the colony, the nest is the civilization that supports it. And the scale of what leafcutter ants build underground is genuinely staggering. For decades, researchers could study ant behavior above ground in detail, but the underground architecture of the nests was almost entirely unknown. The solution scientists eventually arrived at was both practical and dramatic. They poured cement directly into the nest entrances, filling every tunnel and chamber with concrete, then waited for it to set, and then excavated the surrounding soil to reveal the structure in 3 dimensions. What they uncovered looked less like an insect nest and more like the blueprints for a subterranean city. A large ATA colony nest can contain over 7,000 individual chambers. These chambers are not random. They are distributed throughout the structure in an organized way, with fungus garden chambers forming the productive core of the colony, refuse chambers for waste segregation located at the periphery, and networks of tunnels connecting everything in a pattern that balances efficient movement with structural integrity. Some chambers are located as deep as 7 meters below the surface. But the most elegant feature of the nest design is one that the ants didn't consciously engineer and yet achieves something remarkable: passive climate control. The refuse chambers, containing decaying organic material, generate heat as they decompose. That warm air, carrying elevated levels of carbon dioxide from the colony's respiration, rises through the nest's structure and exits through ventilation openings near the top of the mound. As warm air exits, cool fresh air is drawn in through other openings lower down. The nest breathes. It regulates its own atmosphere through a system of convective airflow that the ants maintain not by design, but by the accumulated effect of how they build and where they place things. A mature ATA nest can have 60 or more separate openings to the surface, each playing a role in this ventilation system. The colony is, in a very real sense, living inside a building with air conditioning, one that was never planned, never drafted, never calculated, but that emerged from millions of small behavioral decisions made by millions of individual ants over the years it took to build the structure. We have been circling around a question this entire time, and now it is time to face it directly. Leafcutter ant colonies practice agriculture. They build climate-controlled structures of extraordinary complexity. They maintain road networks. They run sophisticated chemical communication systems. They conduct military operations with specialized units. They manage an economy of labor across millions of individuals. By almost any functional definition, these colonies display a form of intelligence. And yet, no individual ant in the colony is intelligent in the way we normally use that word. No individual ant planned any of this. No individual ant understands the whole system. Each ant follows simple local rules: respond to this chemical, carry this object, groom this fungus, defend this entrance, and the intelligence emerges from the interactions. This is a concept that scientists call emergent complexity, and it challenges something deep in our intuitions about mind and intelligence. We tend to think of intelligence as a property of individual brains, as something located inside a skull, produced by neurons, owned by a self. The leafcutter ant colony suggests that intelligence can also be a property of a system, distributed across many small units with no individual unit possessing more than a tiny fraction of the whole. A single leafcutter ant has roughly 250,000 neurons. A human brain has roughly 100 billion. The gap seems insurmountable. But a colony of 1 million worker ants contains, in aggregate, 250 billion neurons, more than twice the number in a human brain, distributed across millions of bodies, coordinated by chemical signals and behavioral rules that have been refined over 60 million years of evolution. Whether this aggregate system constitutes something we should call intelligence is a genuinely open philosophical question. But its functional outputs, the farms, the cities, the road networks, the military strategies, are difficult to explain any other way. There is a concept in biology called the superorganism, and it applies perfectly here. Rather than thinking of the colony as a collection of individual ants, we should think of it as a single entity, a superorganism, in which each ant plays the role of a cell. The minims are like epithelial cells, maintaining surfaces. The soldiers are like immune cells, defending against pathogens. The media workers are like blood cells, transporting resources. The queen is like the reproductive system, generating new cellular components. Seen this way, the colony's behavior stops being mysterious and starts being exactly what we would expect from a living organism managing its own survival. This reframing also changes how we think about the ant's small individual brain. An individual liver cell in your body is not intelligent. It doesn't need to be. It needs to do its specific, specialized job in response to local chemical signals. And the intelligence of the body emerges from billions of such cells doing their simple jobs in coordination. The ant is in the same position. Its 250,000 neurons are sufficient for its role in the colony. The colony's intelligence lives not in any individual, but in the relationships between individuals. We have been farmers for roughly 10,000 years. We think of agriculture as one of the defining achievements of human civilization, the innovation that made cities and writing and science and everything that followed possible. We are right to be proud of it. Leafcutter ants have been farmers for 60 million years. They figured it out before the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. They have been doing it continuously, without interruption, across more generations than we can meaningfully picture, refining a system so robust and so efficient that it has made them the dominant herbivores of the neotropical rainforest, consuming roughly a quarter of all plant biomass in those ecosystems. By any ecological measure, they are among the most successful large-scale organisms on the planet. What does this mean? I don't think it diminishes human achievement. Our 10,000 years of agriculture produced a civilization that sent rockets to the moon and built the internet and developed vaccines and wrote symphonies. The ants' 60 million years produced a remarkably efficient fungus farm. The comparison is not really between outcomes, it's between paths. Human intelligence is individual intelligence that became social. We each have a large, flexible, general-purpose brain that can learn, plan, innovate, and communicate complex ideas to other large, flexible, general-purpose brains. Our social complexity is built on top of individual cognitive complexity. The system is powerful, but expensive. Brains are metabolically costly, development is slow, and individual humans are vulnerable. Ant intelligence is social intelligence that created the illusion of individual cognition. No single ant is smart, the colony is. The investment is not in individual brains, but in the chemical and behavioral architecture that allows simple individuals to function as a collective superorganism. The system is less flexible. Ant colonies don't write symphonies or change their agricultural methods in a single generation, but it is extraordinarily robust, stable, and efficient over evolutionary time.
Both strategies produced remarkable things. Both are legitimate answers to the problem of how to survive and thrive in a complex world. And contemplating both together, the 60-million-year fungal farmer and the 10,000-year grain farmer, is a useful reminder that intelligence is not one thing. It is a family of solutions to the same underlying problem: how to make enough sense of the world to act effectively within it. The next time you walk through a forest and see that line of moving green sails, I hope you'll stop, not just to appreciate the spectacle, though it is spectacular, but to recognize that you are looking at one of the oldest and most successful civilizations on Earth, operating by principles so different from ours that they challenge our most basic assumptions about minds, societies, and what it means to be intelligent. It has been there since before our primate ancestors had opposable thumbs, running its trails, tending its gardens, building its cities, and solving in its own extraordinary way the exact same problem we are still working on: how to keep going together in a complicated world.